And hello once again, my name is Lupus and I'm a person who makes these videos about literary theory in general. So today, we're going into sort of contextual theories. So this new sort of series of videos, which will be the next couple of weeks, will be, or next couple of months actually, will be the ones that are all about specifically THL2603. It's in the description, but if you're not part of the Unisa Theory of Literature study stuff, you can still enjoy this and learn some stuff. So today we're looking at what is context. Now first, you can see on the screen that I have put a nice little graph, which can help a bit if you're needing any kind of assistance with visualizing the view of different levels of context. So they're labeled as context 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's first just say what is context, right? Before we jump into this. Now the context is essentially the stuff around a text, right? So when we're usually talking about the context, right, say the context of a book. The context of a book will be things like who wrote it, what society led to its creation, what is the historical understanding of that particular text at that particular time, blah, 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 blah. It's everything that is not actually the text, but can help you to understand the text in more depth, right? It is everything that's inside, that's outside of it. But, for instance, there's a lot of text that if you do not understand the context that led to that thing's creation, you won't really understand the purpose of the text in question. This is especially true of things that are not actually fictional, but things that are rather written from, say, a political or philosophical perspective. You know, for instance, you cannot understand, this is like an example, it's very easy to use because everyone knows this. If you've never heard of Hitler, then Mein Kampf probably doesn't really make sense. Like if you've never heard of World War II, Hitler, the Nazis, etc., if you've never heard of those groups, then Mein Kampf, the book that Hitler wrote, you might not understand its purpose. Why was it written in the first place? People don't read that book for the fun of it. There is a specific reason to read it because you're trying to understand the context, or of course if you agree with those things, but we're not going to talk about that now. So yes, context is everything around the text. Now we can look at different levels of context. That's what we're going to do here. So you can see in this first context is sort of the idea of the message itself. So remember, this is when we come to that idea of the sender, the message, the receiver, right? So the person that writes the thing, the sender, the person that reads the thing, the receiver, and of course, the message, which will be the book, the poem, the play, the movie, the whatever it happens to be in this particular case that is that is being looked at. So, the first context is actually the things within the message, but it's things like, say, the words, phrases, and sentences that are within it. Because now, each word only actually makes a sense within the context of other words. Right? So think about it like this. Think about it like this. There's a word. The word go. So you would say, okay, go. Well, it's a verb. It means, transitioning from one place to another. You're going somewhere, right? Cool. But on its own, that doesn't really mean much, does it? Like, yes, you know what the word means, but you don't actually understand why it's being used. So if I were to say, I want to go to the shops, all of a sudden, it is now within the context of the rest of the sentence. It is now specifically about using that going word, that action word, to actually go to a specific place, which is different to just a word on its own. Right? So now I understand that. Context 2 is understanding in relation to other aspects of the text. Right? So how does it relate to all the other parts of a text? So it's not just those individual words and phrases, but how does it relate to other words and phrases? And also how does it relate to things like, say, chapters in the same book? How does it relate to each of these things, right? So, right, imagine a story, right? It's got 10 chapters, Chapter 1 and Chapter 10 are actually not that related to each other. But Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 quite related to each other because they follow from one another. Unless it's written in like a non-chronological sense. But ordinarily, when we think of an ordinary story, an ordinary book, Chapter 5 can only really be understood if you've read Chapter 4. And you can only really understand Chapter 4 if you've read Chapter 3, and so on. And then, of course, you'd only be able to understand what comes next if you've read Chapter 5. So you see, each chapter serves as context for the chapters around it. That's also why you couldn't just open up a Chapter 7 and read it, because you'd be like, well, who are these characters? Why are they doing the things that they are doing? What is the purpose behind all of this stuff? Is there a purpose behind all this stuff? That is an issue that can happen if you were to just pick up something at random and start reading it. Provided it has a chronological story. So, it only makes sense within the context of everything else that is around it. Then context number 3 here, the means through which the communication occurs, so such as like the book, right? A book only makes sense if you understand really what a book is. So there's also context there. You need to know what a book is. So if you're reading a novel, and you're reading this novel, and then you're thinking to yourself, did this really happen? Did this really, the events in Lord of the Rings, did they really happen? But now you, as someone who understands what fiction is, would understand, no. Lord of the Rings didn't happen. It's a made-up story. A person made up this story. It is fiction. It is not non-fiction. It is actually created as it's essentially a lie that is created for entertainment or whatever purposes a book might be made for. That's a different type of argument, right? So you need to actually understand what that thing is. If you've never seen a poem before, then you won't really understand what a poem is. So that becomes a bit of a difficult thing there, doesn't it? Now then, context 4 is where you get to the historical, political, social situation that led to its creation. So let's say if we were to take something like Lord of the Rings, actually, again. Lord of the Rings exists within a specific social environment, and a specific political environment, and a specific historical environment. It was written after World War II. Now there are people who argue that it has roots in World War II, but the thing is, Tolkien actually was a soldier in World War I. So you could say that certain political aspects of it might have been influenced by what he experienced in that war. Similar with historical, right, and social. He kind of wrote a lot of his fiction as a way to explore the world of the languages that he created, because he was a philologist and he enjoyed making up languages. So, like, he created his own languages with, fully functioning languages. So, that is its own context that, needs to be understood in that sense, right? And then, also, of course, if we look at the example that we used earlier of a non-fiction text, Mein Kampf, that was published in a very, very specific political environment, right? The 1920s and 1930s, following World War I, led to a very, very specific level of economic depression that heavily affected all of Europe, including Germany, and various countries did turn towards fascism. So that is historical and political understandings. And then, of course, fascism is a political ideology that requires there to be an enemy at all times. There has to be some kind of an enemy. So, of course, that book is full of anti-Semitic hatred, and that also needs to be understood within the context of why that is the case, right? Like, it wouldn't make sense for it to be blaming some other group. Like, imagine if a book from Germany was being racist about Native American people. You'd be like, okay, but there probably aren't that many Native American people in 1920s and 1930s Germany. So it would be weird, right? It would be weird to blame a group that seemingly wasn't really involved at all. So it only makes sense within that specific context. So That's sort of some different levels of context. You can also go further and further and further. You could say, how does it make sense within the context of like a country's literature, etc., etc. Now, the thing is, when it comes to context-centered theories of literature, we are looking at that fourth context, right? These are things like, say, Marxism, feminism, animal studies, etc., etc., etc. These are different context-centered theories that look at that thing, the situation around the text. So historical, political, social, blah, 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 blah. All of those things become the focus there. So just as like a quick, because I'm actually going to make a video, it's going to be like the last of this particular series, about sort of when to use different theoretical concepts like this, so like Marxism, feminism, etc. When would you choose each of these? Well, simple. Marxism, if you were looking at something, say, from a class perspective, right? You want to understand the social class of a particular thing. So you're looking at rich people, poor people, anything like that. That would be when you use Marxism. When you want to look at also sort of power that is oriented around economics. Marxism is often where you would go. Feminism, you would look at things like, the role of men and women, patriarchy, various concepts like that. Now, also, of course, this is very, very generalized because terms like Marxism and feminism are very broad labels. Like, for instance, there's not really such a thing as feminism because feminism is an extremely broad concept because there's also different types of feminism. Like, there isn't actually such a thing as feminism. There are feminisms, plural. So, you get liberal feminism, radical feminism, black feminism, intersectional feminism, ecofeminism, etc., etc., etc. There's all sorts of different types and varieties, and so just calling it all one thing is not really helpful. But for the purposes here, just as a quick explanation, feminism is probably going to be looking at things like gender, possibly sexuality, depending on which type, things like that. So if you were to look at that context, right, I want to look at, let's say, from a historical perspective, I want to look at the work of someone like Oscar Wilde, looking back from a feminist perspective, understanding it from, say, actually, you'd probably rather use something like queer theory, where you'd be looking back and looking at it from the perspective of it being written by a gay man. That kind of thing. It would be why you would do that. Or let's say with animal studies, which is kind of my main area, if you were to look at a text that makes use of animals in some way, you could say, well, why does it use animals this way, and how does it use animals in the particular way that it does? So that would be also looking at the context, because animals form part of our contextual environment. They live with us, a lot of us eat them, etc., etc. So you would have to look at all of those kind of things. So that is what, when it comes to these context-centered theories, that is what we're looking at. That is what the context is. It's that particular level of context. But it's good to remember that there are different levels of context. But when we refer to it in literary theory, we're generally referring to this, sort of fourth contextual layer, which is historical, political, social, etc., etc. So, it's also important to note that you cannot actually look at each of these sections in complete isolation. All of the different levels of the context overlap with one another and they all inform each other. So you can't say that context 1 has nothing to do with context 4. Yes, it does. Context 1 would be like the specific words used. And now the thing is, let's say, for instance, if you are from a particular era and you want to write a racist book. Also, just by the way, there is a bird being very loud outside. I see why. He's literally outside my window. Just standing there, making noises. Anyway, it's a bit of ambient sound, so it's fine. Anyway, you cannot look at these in complete isolation. So imagine, right, a book written in a particular period in which we were very, very happy with people publishing racial slurs in their books. A lot of classics do very much have racial slurs just in them. Now, that is pretty much context 1, right? That is like the word. That's like a word. And that only really makes sense when you look at it from the perspective of context number 4. If you were to put a racial slur into a book now, either it would have to be because it serves some kind of a purpose. If, say, a book was published and it's set during a segregation era, then you could say, okay, well, maybe there's slurs in it there. It could be in a earlier period in which slurs were fine, or it could be in some way critical of slurs, or of course it could just be published by a racist. You do get, for instance, white supremacists like publishing houses and stuff. So, but that is still a context that you have to understand. So the reason that slur can exist is because of the historical circumstances in which it exists, right? So that's why context is very important, understanding why the different layers of the context operate as they do. All right, now the final thing we're going to pretty much look at here is some issues in context. Like, what makes it a bit difficult? Like, why does context become a bit of a difficult thing for us to deal with? So, of course, like, literature is made by people, and people are not exactly easy to define or slot into a specific way. Humans are also, if you were to say, oh, well, this period of time was a period of time in which there was lots of racism. But of course, not everybody during those periods of time was racist. So even if you were to say, look at the American South during slavery, there were things like the Underground Railroad. There were people in the South who were against slavery and people who actively fought against it. Probably not that many, but they did exist. So you can't just say, oh, well, this historical context is then obviously completely, say everybody who lived in 1920s and 1930s Germany was racist. You can't make that claim because there will always be difficulties there in terms of when it does and when it doesn't, work out that way. Context doesn't, the historical context doesn't mean that everybody falls for it. Also, of course, literature exists within a specific social context. That is also true. You can't sort of say that, you can't sit there and say that everything from a particular period or whatever applies to all people, because, say, there would have been different people from different, say, classes or groups. Also, let's go back to that, to a Mein Kampf example, just because of how easy it is and how everybody sort of knows it. There were lots and lots of German Jewish people, and they were part of that same context. They were then blamed for all the for the problems. They were blamed incorrectly for all of these different problems, but they were also German people. They might have been classified differently by the Nazi regime, but they were actually still German nationals. So they exist within that same context, but they did exist within their own context of being within Jewish communities in that particular national context. So there would be different groups within larger contexts that then inform the way that they exist and the way they experience the world. Then, of course, you get the idea that we live in a relativistic world. This is also true. Context changes, and context also becomes very malleable and kind of difficult to pin down when you get to certain aspects of it. So relativism is the idea that sort of things aren't objectives, things are not necessarily factual, right? Different people disagree about how we should do all sorts of things, from ethics to politics to whatever. Different people view it in different ways. It is all relative. Now, like something like moral relativism that's maybe an easy way to understand it. Moral sort of relativism, or thinking that there is no real objectivity. If you take it to its furthest extreme, you're going to say that ethics doesn't really exist as a universal. Different people view it as a different way. So, say some people will see certain things as morally wrong and others will not. That would be morally relativistic, sort of. And if we were to say that they're both correct, they would be well, not necessarily correct, but if they both have an equal, not necessarily right, but they both exist, that would be morally relativistic, that they both kind of have their own viewpoints that are not necessarily applied to the other. So imagine, say, a society that says divorce is always wrong and a society that says divorce is always fine. So it's wrong or it's right. Those are opposites of each other. So if we were to say that both of those societies are fine to have that particular belief, we're saying that that's morally sort of relativistic in that sense. And context works much the same way. It is all relative. How we interpret these contextual situations will differ from person to person, both within the context and outside the context. So, yeah. Then, of course, literature exists within a political context, and there is this idea of the political turn and politicization of sort of, say, literature, right? So, literature can be used for political reasons. Like, you can, when it comes to the context, within a particular piece of literature, it can have a very specific political message behind it. Why was this book written? Right? If we look at non-fiction, say Mein Kampf, we know the reason it was written. But if we look at, say, something else, if we look at something like George Orwell's 1984, why was that book written? It is a critique of things like authoritarianism, specifically with an aim towards things like Stalinism, but that means you need to understand things like Stalinism, and to really understand why it was criticizing it in the way that it was criticizing it. So literature becomes political in that particular context. So then the next one is that literature can serve as a means of social action. Literature can actually serve, probably a famous one is, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a famous book from the United States, which is seen as a very important book for leading to certain political changes. Like, some people say that it had a major influence on the lead up to the American Civil War, because it's basically an anti-slavery book. And that is an interesting thing to happen, that a book, like a fiction book, can have an actual influence on the outside context. So books can inform the context just as much as the context can inform the books. So that is quite an interesting, little thing there. The last thing here is that literature is a material thing made through physical means and through labor as well. So literature isn't just ideas floating around the ether. Literature is an actual physical thing that you can touch, you can engage with, and it's also written by an actual human being who had thoughts, feelings. There were reasons that they did what they did, the reasons that they said what they said in that particular text, etc., etc., etc. That is all very, very important stuff, right? That it needs to be understood as something that's actually real. It's not just, it was a political situation. It's like, no. A book is an actual, real thing you can touch with your hands. And in terms of, say, ebooks, it is still physical. It still takes up space on a computer or a tablet or a phone or whatever. It is still physical. It can be touched in some sense. And it is made through labor. It is made by actual people. It's not just an idea that floated through the void. Human beings made it by working. And often say in certain places where, like, say, printing or the production of paper, all of these kind of things also leads to different contextual understandings of literature in general. But yes, we are going to end there. You can find sort of the details about the book from which this comes in the description below. And so yeah, that is all done. If you enjoyed this, if you felt you learned something, you can do the usual things like comment and subscribe. And also, if you have any questions, please leave a comment. I will see if I can answer said questions. And if you have any specific sort of literary theory areas that you would like explained, put it in the comments. If I know it, I might be able to explain it in a more understandable way if you are struggling with it. Other than that, if you want to support this channel and the kind of stuff I do, you can check out one of my books, the latest of which is Flesh Sown Blues. It's where I'm putting most of my focus at the moment. Flesh Sown Blues is a cyberpunk story about a world in which human beings have figured out how to transfer our consciousness into a machine, or basically into a chip, that we can put into whatever body we want. However, it's a disgustingly capitalistic world, and it is very miserable. So if you like sadness, then check it out. Details in the description. Otherwise, have a great day, week, and month ahead, and goodbye.